Some prayers are so small nobody hears them but God. Not the kind a preacher says into a microphone. Not the kind painted on church wall. I mean the kind said by a tired woman in a farmhouse kitchen with one hand wrapped around a coffee mug and the other resting on an envelope she does not want to open. On the first Monday of March, Caleb Mercer watched his wife Ruth slide one finger beneath the flap of a certified letter from Flint Hills Community Bank. Morning light was coming through the lace curtain over the sink. The percolator had just gone quiet. Outside, the east pasture was still silver with frost, and the old gate by the cattle lot leaned the same way it had leaned for 15 years. Ruth did not say, "Lord, save us." She only whispered, "Help us tell the truth today." If you have ever watched a family hold on to something that felt too expensive to lose and too precious to sell, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Because what sat inside that envelope was not just a notice. It was the kind of paper that changes the way a house sounds. Caleb read it once standing up. Then he read it again sitting down. The bank was accelerating the note. Unless the past due balance, fees, and accrued interest were cured within 21 days, the Mercer's machinery would be scheduled for public auction. If the deficiency remained after liquidation, the bank would proceed towards sale of the real estate that secured the loan. Their 160 acres. The same 160 Caleb's father had bought a little at a time outside Redfield, Kansas, beginning in 1958. The same 160 where Ruth had hung sheets on a line behind the house every spring since 1991. The same 160 where their son Eli learned to back a hay trailer crooked and their daughter Hannah learned to bottle feed a runt calf in a feed room that always smelled like sweet grain, iodine, and dust. There are words banks use that sound clean on paper. Collateral, security, liquidation, deficiency. But in a farmhouse kitchen, those words mean something else. They mean the walnut table your mother sanded by hand. They mean the barn post with your children's heights penciled into the side. They mean the patch of yard where your father buried an old bird dog under a flat stone no one else would ever notice. Caleb folded the letter once. Then once again. His jaw worked like he was chewing something tough, but he had not touched breakfast. Ruth looked at him and asked the only question that mattered. "Is it the land?" Caleb stared at the window over the sink. "Not first," he said. And that was the cruelest part. Not first. First the machinery. Then, if the money still did not work, the land. By noon that same day, the sale date was already moving around town faster than spring wind through hedge trees. Men at the co-op lowered their voices when Caleb's name came up. A cashier at the feed store glanced at Ruth with the careful softness people use when they know bad news before they know what to say. By evening, even the pastor's wife had heard enough to send over a ham and noodle casserole without asking a single question. But the question was already sitting in that house anyway. What do you save when you cannot save everything? Because what the bank wanted was not only payment. What it wanted was proof. Proof that this family still had enough cash flow, enough discipline, enough collateral value, and enough will to justify one more chance. And if you think this story is about one dramatic moment when the whole town stood up and did the impossible, it is not. Not at first. At first, it was about 3 people sitting at one kitchen table, each of them hiding a different fear. Caleb feared he had waited too long to admit how bad it was. Ruth feared the farm would stay standing and the family would not. And Eli, who had not yet come in from the south lot, was about to learn that the old red sale bill in the bank officer's hand had his name written all over it, even though the debt was not technically his. That morning began with a whisper. By the time the auctioneer's trailer pulled into Bourbon County 6 weeks later, that whisper had become the kind of story neighbors tell for years. But before the bids, before the gravel lot filled up, before the bank changed its tone, there was a winter of silence in one farmhouse and a truth nobody there wanted to say out loud. The Mercers were not just behind. They were breaking. The Mercer place never looked like much from the road, and that was part of why Caleb loved it. A white frame house with a porch that listed just enough to show its age. A red barn with paint gone chalky on the south side. 2 corrugated grain bins that had not held grain in years and now stored mineral tubs, fence posts, salt blocks, and every bolt Caleb swore he might need someday. 72 acres of brome and fescue pasture rolling north toward a hedge line. 38 acres that usually went to wheat. 23 in beans when the ground would take them. The rest creek bottom, house lot pins, and the scraps that make up a real place when a survey map stops talking and life begins. Kayla Mercer was 58 that spring, broad-shouldered in the way men stay after decades of lifting things wrong and working anyway. He had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck whenever money came up, and in the past 2 years he had rubbed it enough to where the skin raw some weeks. He was not a reckless man. That mattered. He had never been the kind to buy shiny iron just to be seen with it. His main tractor was a 1978 John Deere 4440 with faded paint and one door hinge that sagged in wet weather. He still used a Vermeer baler that tied fine when it wanted to and cussed back when it didn't. Ruth kept the books in a 3-ring binder with yellow tabs and neat blue writing. She taught part-time at the elementary school in Uniontown, led funeral dinners when someone died, and knew exactly how much diesel had gone up without ever once needing to complain about it. She was not loud in her faith. You saw it in smaller things. The stack of sympathy cards she never forgot to mail. The way she touched Caleb's arm before hard conversations. The little Bible on the end table with no decorative cover and no dramatic place in the room, just pages worn thin at the edges. Their son Eli was 32 and had the dangerous combination of a good back and a short temper. He had come home after a year of welding work in Joplin because Caleb's knees were getting worse and because, if he was honest, he had always believed the place would someday become his. He knew every weak board in the East Corral, every field rock along the North Line, every sound that old 4440 made right before the hydraulic pressure dropped. Their daughter Hannah lived 25 minutes away in Fort Scott and worked in the office of a crop insurance agency. She was the one who left, which in farm families is sometimes treated like betrayal, even when everybody understands why. Hannah loved the place in a different way. She remembered birthdays, insurance renewals, and where the original abstract of title was kept. She also remembered exactly how many nights she lay awake in high school listening to Caleb and Ruth talk in low voices about fertilizer, vet bills, and whether they could make one more note payment before selling calves. That farm had its routines the way old churches have liturgy. Caleb in the lot before daylight. Ruth tapping invoice totals with a pencil eraser after supper. Eli backing the hay trailer by feel, never by mirrors. Sunday dinners that started late because cattle do not care what day it is. November boots drying by the mudroom register. The smell of PTO grease. Laundry soap and beef stew all in the same house. There have been good years. Enough of them to make the harder ones survivable. In 2016, wheat had yielded better than expected, and Caleb paid down principal for the first time in a way that made him stand straighter for a month. In 2018, hay prices rose after a dry summer, and Ruth let herself talk about fixing the porch. In 2020, Hannah helped refinance a small equipment note into better terms through a lender who still knew what a cow-calf outfit looked like on paper. But farms are rarely hurt by one thing. They're hurt by 3 or 4 things arriving in the same season and refusing to leave. And the Mercer place, by the time that certified letter hit the table, had already been wounded in more places than anyone in town knew. If this reminds you of a farm family you've known, or one you came from, you already understand something important. Collapse almost never looks dramatic from the outside. From the road, it just looks like another place with a little rust around the edges. The trouble began in pieces small enough to explain away. First came 2 dry summers close together. Not total disaster years. Worse than that. The kind that still give you enough to keep going, but not enough to catch up. The stock pond in the west pasture dropped low by August. Caleb bought extra hay he should not have needed. Then fertilizer jumped. Then diesel. Then the old Heston mower conditioner broke a gearbox in the middle of second cutting, and the used part he found in Nevada, Missouri, still cost more than he told Ruth it had. Then came Ruth's surgery. It was not one of those television illnesses with a sudden speech and a clean ending. It was slower, more ordinary, and in some ways more expensive. Tests. A procedure. Time off. Insurance deductibles that felt designed by people who had never sat at a farm kitchen table in their life. Ruth never complained. That somehow made Caleb feel worse. By the time they rolled in a note renewal in January, the numbers were already thin. The Mercers carried a real estate note on the land, an operating line tied to seed, feed, fertilizer, and fuel, and a smaller equipment balance from a used skid steer Eli insisted would save labor. He had not been wrong. It had saved labor. It just had not saved money fast enough. The previous AG lender, Tom Ballard, had been the kind of banker who asked about calves before he asked about ratios. He retired after the bank merged with a regional chain out of Wichita. In his place came Nolan Price, 38 years old, sharp haircut, pressed shirt, polished boots that had never stepped in a muddy lot long enough to matter. Nolan was not a villain. Caleb kept telling himself that. The man was polite, prompt, educated. He returned calls, but he talked about the Mercer farm the way a mechanic might talk about an engine on a stand. Useful language. Accurate language. Language that never once touched memory. At the January meeting, Nolan laid out the problem in sentences that were hard to argue with. Input costs had risen faster than net return. 2 years of carryover debt were now sitting on top of one another. Collateral coverage had weakened. Liquidity was poor. The bank would renew the operating line, but only with tighter reporting, monthly financial review, and additional security. That last phrase sounded small. Additional security. What it meant was Ruth signing too. What it meant was the house. What it meant was the equipment list. What it meant was Eli standing outside after the meeting, kicking a frozen mud clod across the gravel and saying, "He just put a rope around everything we own." Caleb told him to watch his mouth. Eli said, "You watch the note." That was February. In March, a late freeze hurt the wheat heads. In April, one of the bred cows went down with hardware disease. In May, heavy rain washed the low crossing and left the creek bottom beans 2 weeks late. In June, the price on the fall calves softened just enough to erase whatever fragile confidence Caleb had been trying to build. The farm did not fail all at once. It sagged. That is what people miss when they talk about losing land. They think it happens with one dramatic notice, one bad crop, one cruel banker, one final scene. But usually it happens in the daily humiliation of math. Ruth stopped asking when Caleb thought they might repaint the porch. Eli stopped talking about fencing the North 40. Hannah started calling twice a week instead of once, not because anyone told her to, but because daughters who grew up around money trouble can hear in the silence between sentences. Then came the missed payment. Not the first late one. The first one they simply could not make without bouncing something else uglier. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed that night with both hands hanging between his knees and told Ruth he would fix it after cattle sold. Ruth said, very quietly, "You said that after hay." He looked at her then, and for a second the whole room felt older than both of them. Have you ever watched somebody you love keep saying, "one more month," because saying the real number out loud would break something inside them? If you have, you know this next part before I tell it. One missed payment did not bring the bank to the door, but it brought the bank closer. And once a lender starts leaning forward, every family secret starts leaning forward too. The night Caleb finally told the whole truth, there was no thunderstorm, no dramatic music, no one dropping to their knees in cinematic grief. There was meatloaf gone cold on the stove. There was one fork still sitting in Eli's plate because he had stopped eating halfway through. There was a yellow legal pad on the table, Ruth's reading glasses, and the bank letter folded so many times the crease had gone white. Hannah came in straight from town, still wearing office clothes and carrying a tote bag with a laptop, 2 folders, and a carton of store-bought cookies she forgot to take out. She sat down, looked once at her mother's face, once at the paper, and said, "How bad?" Caleb gave her the short version first, because men like Caleb often begin with a lie of mercy. "Rough." Hannah kept looking at him. Ruth said, "Tell it straight." So he did. Past due balance. Accrued interest. The operating line out of compliance. The bank's demand for liquidation of machinery if the cure amount was not paid. Possible real estate action if the auction proceeds did not cover enough. Eli pushed his chair back, so hard it caught on the floorboards. "You signed the house." Caleb said nothing. Ruth answered for him. "I signed too." Eli stared at both of them like they had changed shape right there in front of him. "You put the house and the land behind feed, fuel, and a skid steer?" That was unfair, and everybody there knew it, which is one reason it landed so hard. Hannah stepped in first. Yelling won't fix the note. Eli turned on her. "Easy for you to say. You go home when this is over." The room went flat. Ruth closed her eyes. That was the line nobody had said in years, and everybody had heard anyway. Hannah set her jaw, not because she was not hurt, but because she was. Then Ruth did something small and stronger than shouting. She reached over, put her palm flat on the bank letter, and said, "We are not going to tear the family apart before the bank ever has to." Nobody answered. After a long minute, she stood, walked to the end table, and brought back that worn little Bible. She did not open it to perform anything. She did not preach. She simply set it beside the legal pad and said, "I don't need a verse right now. I need honesty." That was the faith turn. Low but real. Not certainty, not miracle talk. Just the decision that if they were going to suffer, they were not going to do it while lying to one another. Caleb admitted he had been moving bills between months longer than he told Ruth. He admitted he thought cattle prices would improve fast enough to outrun the line. He admitted he had let pride decide too much because he could not bear being the man who lost his father's ground. Then Hannah admitted something too. She had already called a farm attorney in Fort Scott that afternoon just to ask what foreclosure timelines usually looked like and whether Chapter 12 was something they should understand. She had not wanted to scare them before she knew more. Eli laughed once, bitter and tired. "So we're already talking bankruptcy?" Hannah said, "I'm talking options. There's a difference." Ruth sat down again and finally opened the Bible, not to a dramatic promise, but to the Psalms. She looked at the page and then beyond it, almost like she was thinking through the words before reading them aloud. Then she closed it. "I think tonight," she said, "we asked for enough light to see tomorrow." That line stayed with Eli longer than the rest of the conversation. Enough light to see tomorrow. Not save next year. Not guarantee the farm. Not make the banker kinder. Just enough light for the next decision. That is sometimes what faith looks like on rural ground when people are too tired for speeches. And the next decision was brutal. If they wanted any chance of keeping the 160, they might have to agree to sell the machinery before the bank forced them to. The land could still be saved, but only if they were willing to watch the tools of that life leave first. Flint Hills Community Bank sat on the square in Fort Scott with brick walls, clean windows, and a row of fake ficus trees that always made Caleb uneasy. The meeting was set for 9 o'clock Thursday. Nolan Price was already there with a yellow folder, a printed collateral sheet, and a tone of voice polished smooth enough to make hard things sound reasonable. Beside him sat Dana Rusk, the bank's workout officer from Wichita, a woman in her 50s with rimless glasses and the kind of expression that never gave away whether she felt sorry for you or had already moved on to the next file. Caleb wore his one good snap shirt. Ruth carried the binder. Hannah brought a laptop and 3 cash flow projections. Eli came because he refused to stay home, though every muscle in his face suggested he would rather have been repairing fence in sleet. Dana did most of the talking. The bank, she said, was willing to avoid immediate foreclosure proceedings if the Mercers cooperated with an orderly liquidation plan and demonstrated a feasible path forward. The equipment auction could be scheduled for late April. The bank would apply net proceeds after commission and expenses to the past due amounts and principal reduction. If the remaining debt service could be supported under a downsized operating plan, the bank might consider forbearance on the real estate action. Might consider. Caleb heard every word, but that was the one that lodged. Hannah asked the kind of questions Nolan did not enjoy because they were specific. What cure amount did the bank require to suspend real estate sale activity? Would the bank release certain equipment from the collateral list if alternate custom work contracts were secured? Would they consider an FSA-backed restructure if fresh projections supported viability? What would trigger acceleration after the auction? Dana answered carefully. The cure figure, with fees and interest through projected sale date, was just over $84,000. The bank would review any written contract support. No guarantees could be made in the room. Any missed reporting or further payment default could restart the process immediately. Eli leaned forward. So let me translate. We sell the iron. Maybe you don't take the land, and even then you're not promising anything. Nolan said, I'm saying cooperation helps. Eli said, that's not the same sentence. Caleb cut in before the room turned mean. What do you need from us by Friday? That changed the energy. Bankers understand papers. Dana slid the list across. Signed auction consent. Updated equipment condition sheet. Current cattle inventory. Projected 12-month operating plan. Any outside income documentation. Any pending sale contracts. Any evidence of family contribution or working capital support. Ruth asked, if we do all that, are you willing to postpone a land sale date? Dana paused before answering, which was answer enough. We are willing, she said, to review the file in good faith. Good faith. It was almost funny hearing that phrase in a room where every word had dollar signs under it. On the drive home, nobody spoke until they hit the county line. Then Eli said, we should file Chapter 12 and make them deal. Hannah said, maybe, but if we can show a viable downsize first, we preserve more control. Caleb looked out over a field just starting to green and said, I'm not ready to hand judge this place. Ruth said, then don't act like we have endless time. That afternoon, they spread papers over the kitchen table until supper and long after. Equipment list: John Deere 4440, skid steer, Vermeer baler, disc mower, rake, stock trailer, older gooseneck flatbed, post driver, feed wagon, 2 gravity wagons. Shop tools the bank had listed too broadly, and Hannah fought to carve out. Operating plan: sell more hay standing, custom higher wheat harvest, reduce cow numbers from 42 pairs to 26. Lease summer pasture instead of overbuying feed. Ruth's school income included. Eli's welding side work finally written down instead of treated like pride money. And under all of it, one painful truth. The only way to save the land was to stop pretending they could farm it the same way they used to. People talk about losing land like the worst pain is public. It is not. The public part comes later, with sale bills and gossip, and neighbors pretending not to slow down when they drive past. The first pain is private. It lives in the old arguments that suddenly become expensive. That Saturday, Eli found the skid steer payment book in the desk drawer under a stack of receipts and learned something Caleb had not meant for him to find. The machine was not on the balance he thought it was. Caleb had refinanced part of it into the operating line 6 months earlier to make another payment fit. When Eli came into the shop holding the booklet, Caleb knew before a word was said. You rolled it into the line? Caleb kept tightening a bolt on the workbench, though nothing on the bench needed tightening. I handled it. That's not what I asked. Caleb set the wrench down. I was keeping us moving. Eli's voice turned low, which was always when it was most dangerous. You kept me working for a machine I thought we were closer to owning. It was still work we needed done. That isn't the point. No, it was not. The point was that Eli had built his future on information that was no longer true. He had turned down steadier welding work. He had stayed. He had counted on the place. And now the numbers beneath that hope were shifting under his feet. Ruth heard the argument from the porch and went in only when she heard metal hit concrete. It was a shovel, not a fist. But the sound did the same thing to a house. Later that night, Hannah and Eli sat on the tailgate behind the barn where they used to split popsicles as kids in July. "You still think I left because I didn't love this place?" she asked. Eli looked out at the lot light and said nothing. Hannah said, "I left because I knew what it was doing to Mom, and because I knew if I stayed, I'd either marry the farm or hate it." That got his attention. She went on, "And you stay because you loved it enough to let it define you. So don't pretend I don't understand what this is." After a while, Eli said, "If they take it, I don't know who I am after." There it was. Not acreage. Identity. That is what foreclosure threatens in rural families and why outsiders sometimes miss the size of the wound. A farm is rarely only an asset. It is a role, a last name, a witness, sometimes even an alibi. If the place remains, a man can keep believing his people amounted to something visible. At supper the next evening, Ruth finally brought out the other secret. Her brother Wayne had offered, quietly, to lend them $15,000 from the sale of some rental property in Pittsburgh. She had not wanted to mention it because she knew exactly how Caleb would hear it, as humiliation. Caleb did hear it that way. "I'm not borrowing from your brother to make a banker feel safer." Ruth looked at him with a tiredness older than the argument. "Then stop talking like pride is a crop we can eat." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Caleb did something he had almost never done in front of his children. He cried. Not loudly, not theatrically, just one hand over his mouth and his shoulders gone weak. "I told my dad I'd keep it whole," he said. "That's what I told him in the hospital. I said I'd keep it whole." Ruth walked around the table and put both arms around him from behind. Hannah looked down. Eli stared at the wall. And the entire story shifted. Because once the promise was spoken, the children could finally see what had been driving every bad delay, every half-truth, every stubborn decision. This was not just debt. This was a son still trying not to fail a dead father. And from that moment on, the question changed. No longer, how do we save the farm exactly as it was? Now it became, what part of the promise actually mattered? The dirt? The equipment? The image? Or the family still sitting in that room? If you had to choose, would you save the land or save the family first? I would honestly love to know how people answer that. Because the Mercers, for the first time, were about to make a choice instead of just enduring consequences. The plan that finally emerged did not feel brave. It felt humiliating, which is often how the right plan feels at first. Hannah spent 2 evenings with spreadsheets, crop insurance records, and a county extension worksheet until she built a lean operating projection that even Dana Rusk would have to admit was serious. Eli called 3 welding clients and turned weekend repair work into actual written commitments. Ruth accepted her brother Wayne's $15,000, but only after making him sign a note that said family loan, 0 interest, repay when able. That made Caleb mad for half a day and relieved by nightfall. Then they started deciding what could go. The gravity wagons first, then the flatbed, then the older feed wagon, then, harder, the skid steer, then harder still, the baler and disc mower if the numbers required it. The 4440 sat on the sheet like a last name on a gravestone. Eli said, "If that tractor goes, we're custom hiring everything." Hannah said, "If it's staying cost the land, it's not really staying." The auction company out of Nevada, Missouri, came Tuesday to photograph equipment. The sale bill was plain white with black lettering. No drama, just inventory, terms, date, and location. That somehow hurt worse than if it had looked theatrical. Real trouble is usually printed plainly. Something else began happening too. Word spread, not because the Mercers wanted sympathy, because rural towns are built out of people who say they mind their own business and then proceed to know everything by supper. But word does different things depending on what kind of people are hearing it. At the co-op, manager Dean Holcomb told Caleb he'd put in writing that the Mercers could delay some input purchases if the bank approved the reduced plan. A neighbor named Lester Bean offered summer pasture on shares if the cow numbers dropped. Ruth's church circle never used the word foreclosure, but by Friday there were envelopes in the mailbox with grocery money, diesel gift cards, and one note that simply said, "You helped us in '09. Let's help now." Caleb hated every envelope. He kept every envelope. Then came the idea that changed the whole shape of the auction. It started with an old cattleman named Merle Stafford who had known Caleb's father. Merle stood at the lot fence, looked over the sale list, spat into the dust, and said, "If folks buy right, you can maybe still use some of this stuff till season's done." Eli frowned. "Buy right how?" Merle shrugged. "Buy it, then lease it back cheap. Or leave it where it sits till hay's up. Ain't illegal to help a man breathe." That was not a miracle plan. It was better. It was rural logic. By auction week, a handful of neighbors knew exactly what they were doing without ever needing a meeting about it. No speeches, no grandstanding, no organized stunt. Just practical decisions by people who understood that if the Mercers lost every tool on the place immediately, the projected recovery would die before it started. The night before the auction, Ruth made sandwiches nobody ate. Caleb walked the machine shed alone after dark. He laid one hand on the fender of the 4440. He stood by the baler. He looked at the skid steer bucket with dried mud still packed in one corner from winter feeding. Then he turned out the light. Back in the house, he found Ruth at the table again. Same table, same light, different night. He sat down and said, "Tomorrow, if it goes high enough, we may keep the ground." Ruth nodded. Then he said, "And if we keep the ground, it won't look like before." She answered the way only somebody who had lived all those years with him could answer. Nothing living ever does. Auction mornings have their own weather, even when the sky does not change. By 7:30, pickups were already lining the Mercer lane. Boots hit gravel. Men folded sale bills into back pockets. A concession trailer hissed coffee steam beside the machine shed. The auctioneer's sound system crackled once, then settled into that thin metallic hum everybody in farm country knows before a single bid is called. The bank had sent Nolan Price and another man from Wichita nobody introduced. Dana Rusk did not come. Caleb noticed that immediately. Ruth stood near the porch steps in a denim jacket and work gloves, though she had nothing to carry. Hannah moved between the house and the lot with a folder under one arm. Eli tried to stay busy checking tires and moving gates, even though the sale crew had already done what needed doing. The crowd was bigger than Caleb expected. Not enormous, just enough to make dignity complicated. Cattlemen, neighbors, 2 equipment jockeys from over by Girard, a custom hay operator, the co-op manager, 3 people Caleb had not seen in years, and Merle Stafford, standing like an old fence post beside the 4440, saying little. The auction started with smaller items. Chains, air compressor, torch set, post driver, tool chests. Bids came steady. Fair, maybe a little better than fair. Then the wagons sold stronger than expected. Then the flatbed sold to a man from Mound City who immediately walked over to Eli and said, "You can use it through wheat if you need. Just bring it back with decent tires." Eli blinked once, like he had not heard right. The first rail turn came with the skid steer. Nolan Price had it penciled at $22,000 in the collateral sheet. Everybody in that county knew it was worth less. 20 at best. Maybe 19.5. The bidding opened at 16. Jumped to 18. Then 19.5. Then 21. Then 23. Caleb looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Merle. Merle did not look at anybody. The skid steer brought 24,100. Nolan stopped riding for a second. Then the disc mower sold high. Then the rake. Then one of the equipment jockeys pushed the baler further than market logic said he should, only to walk over after and tell Ruth, "My nephew's place can spare it till August. If Eli needs it for first cutting, call me." Nobody announced what was happening. That was why it mattered. This was not performance. This was people making decisions with money. The 4440 came last among the major pieces, just before noon, sun high enough now to show every dent in the hood. The auctioneer gave a usual rundown. 1978 John Deere 4440 quad range, showing just over 8,100 hours. One owner family, local tractor, starts easy, field ready. Who'll give me? Bid started strong and kept climbing. Caleb did not breathe at 20. Did not breathe at 22. At 24, he looked at the ground. At 25.5, he heard somebody behind him say, "Keep going." At 26, Merle raised one finger. At 26.5, the custom hay operator answered. At 27, Merle nodded again. Sold. $27,000. Higher than it had any business bringing. And when the clerk finished writing, Merle walked straight to Caleb and said, "It stays here till your wheat's out and hay's done. Then Eli can rent hours on it cheap through fall if he wants. Paper it however the bank likes." Caleb tried to answer and could not. But the auction still was not the whole turning point. The real turn happened an hour later, under the white side awning of the auction trailer, where Hannah finally cornered Nolan Price with updated sale totals, the extension-backed cash flow, Eli's welding contracts, Dean Holcomb's co-op letter, and a handwritten commitment from Lester Bean for pasture. Nolan read the sheet twice. "You already had some of this?" he asked. Hannah said, "We had it. You didn't ask the right question." By then, the net sale numbers were clear. After commission and expenses, the proceeds are going to reduce the arrearage far more than the bank projected. Combined with Wayne's family loan, Ruth's income, the custom work plan, and the reduced herd strategy, the file no longer looked like an inevitable land loss. It looked, frustratingly for the bank, like a wounded but viable operation. Nolan stepped away to call Wichita. Caleb stood 50 yards off, pretending to watch a man load gates. Ruth held both hands together at her waist. Eli paced. 10 minutes. Then 12. Then 16. Finally, Nolan came back, slid the phone into his coat pocket, and said the sentence Caleb would remember as long as he lived. "The bank is suspending action on the real estate sale, pending restructure review. No guarantees past that. But the land auction will not be posted. Not posted. Not saved forever. Not erased. Just not posted." And sometimes that is exactly how real hope arrives. Not with a trumpet. With one sentence that lets a family go home still owning the dirt under their house. The Mercer place was quieter after the auction, but not empty. That was the first strange mercy. The yard still looked like their yard. The barn still threw the same afternoon shadow across the lot. The house still carried the smell of coffee, laundry soap, and old wood heat. What changed was the outline of the life inside it. By July, the restructure papers were signed. The bank split the remaining obligations into terms the reduced plan could actually carry. The operating line came back smaller and meaner, watched monthly with no room for nonsense. 26 cow-calf pairs remained instead of 42. Wheat harvest was custom cut that year. Eli welded 3 evenings a week in town and hayed weekends with equipment that belonged partly to other people and temporarily to the grace of decent neighbors. The 4440 did stay through harvest. Merle kept his word, and so did the custom operator who let the baler remain till first cutting was done. Dean at the co-op stretched payables just enough to keep feed moving. Wayne never once called about the $15,000, which made Caleb finally pay back the first $3,000 as soon as calf money allowed, because debt from kin sits differently on a man's chest than debt from bank. The cost of survival was real. The Mercers did not beat the system. They did not get everything back. They did not emerge richer. They did not stand on the porch and laugh at the banker. They simply kept the 160. And for a long time, that was enough. The real healing took longer than the financial kind. Caleb had to learn that keeping a promise to his father did not mean preserving every machine, every habit, or every illusion of control. Ruth had to say out loud, more than once, that she wanted a living husband more than a perfectly intact farm. Hannah began coming out on Tuesdays to handle paperwork and eventually moved her insurance work partly remote. Eli, who had spent months angry at everybody, slowly became the one most willing to adapt. That surprised even him. In October, after first frost browned the lot grass, Caleb and Eli repainted the porch instead of fixing more fence. It was a small thing, but Ruth cried when she saw the first new white boards laid in place. Not because the porch mattered more than pasture, because it meant the future had re-entered the property. One Sunday after church, not a dramatic Sunday, not a testimony Sunday, just an ordinary one, Caleb stood outside under the fellowship hall awning while men talked weather and feeder prices. Merle came up beside him and said, "Your dad would have called that a kept farm." Caleb looked out toward the highway a long time before answering. "No," he said. He would have called it a spared one. That was a better word. Spared. Because the land was not saved by pride, not by silence, not by one clever trick. It was spared by truth, reduction, help, paperwork, sacrifice, and a community that knew the difference between rescuing a man's ego and preserving a family's chance. The next spring, Hannah found the old certified letter in the desk drawer while looking for fence receipts. She started to throw it away. Then she stopped. She folded it once and tucked it into the farm binder behind the restructure documents. Not to remember the bank. To remember the day the family finally stopped pretending. Happy endings in the country rarely mean everything turned out easy. Usually they mean the right thing remained. On the Mercer place, the right thing was still there. A white house, a red barn, a field lined in evening light, and 160 acres still carrying the same last name. Before I leave you with this one, I want to ask something that goes deeper than an auction. What do you think really saves a family place when hard times come? Is it the money? The land itself? The neighbors? The willingness to change? Or the moment people finally tell each other the truth? And if your family has ever walked through debt, foreclosure pressure, auction day, or the painful work of starting over, I'd really like to hear about it in the comments. Some people get to keep the farm. Some do not. But sometimes what gets saved first is the part that matters most. For the Mercers, the bank came for their 160 acres. What changed everything was not just what happened at the auction. It was what happened before it, around it, and after it. The honesty, the sacrifice, the lowered pride, the help accepted, and the decision that family was worth more than looking unbroken. If this story stayed with you, let me know the part that hit closest to home. And if you had been standing in that gravel lot that day, what would you have done?